There is perhaps no mystery more legendary than that of a lost city, a place that apparently existed, full of people, yet for some reason, no one can find it anymore. How could it have went missing, or did it ever really exist? While Lord of the Rings has many mysteries, it doesn't really have one exactly like this. There are, of course, cities that have been lost due to destruction or abandonment, but a city that is physically missing? That's something else entirely. But that didn't stop Lord of the Rings Online. In this video, we talk about Thafar-gathol, the legendary lost dwarven city. The end of the First Age was a cataclysmic time for the dwarves. In the west, Nogrod and Belagost, the holds of the Firebeards and the Broadbeams, were destroyed. However, according to Lord of the Rings Online, LOTRO, the dwarves of the east were not spared destruction either. In particular, the main hold of the Zeluka dwarves, a stand-in for the Iron Fists, because LOTRO can't use that name, was also destroyed. The Zeluka weren't exactly popular among the other dwarven clans, so they wandered around, homeless and shunned, until King Durin II invited them to the Misty Mountains. King Durin II had already invited the displaced Broadbeams and Firebeards to Khazad-dûm, and many of them accepted. However, the invite to the Zeluka was not to Khazad-dûm, but to Gundabad. Gundabad had been troublesome for Durin's folk of late. According to the legends, Gundabad had been the original hold of Durin the Deathless, but after a while, he went south and founded Khazad-dûm. Khazad-dûm would quickly supersede Gundabad in importance, and the hold was left under the command of Durin's best friend, Mozog. These years were rather grim for Gundabad. The hold was constantly attacked by Morgoth's forces from the north, and over time, Mozog lost 6 of his 7 sons in the fighting. The breaking point came when Mozog hosted an embassy of woodland elves, who came bearing mithril weapons. Mozog, already feeling abandoned by Durin, was enraged and slaughtered the embassy, and had their weapons reforged into mauls. He took the name Grey Maul and started the Grey Maul Rebellion against Durin. The Grey Mauls had some early success against him, largely because they were willing to ally with orcs and trolls. Mozog then constructed a grand city to the south called Bir-Zahar, a golden city, in an attempt to rival Khazad-dûm. In the end, the city was largely destroyed during the climactic battle of the war, where Mozog repented of his deeds and Morgoth's forces attacked both armies. Okay, so back to the Zeluka. Them moving to Gundabad would not only give them a home, but it would also replenish the lessened number of dwarves in that hold. A Zeluka host set out, and then somewhere along the way, near to the Grey Mountains, they vanished. Not a single one would arrive at Gundabad, leading to rumours that the entire host had perished somewhere. For centuries, there was no sign of them. That is, until a lone dwarf emerged, claiming that the Zeluka had founded a legendary city called Thafar-gathol, with wealth that could rival Khazad-dûm. He even claimed that they had found mithril. Of course, this dwarf was labelled as mad, and no one truly learned of what happened to the Zeluka host and Thafar-gathol. However, this dwarf tale would inspire generations of dwarven treasure hunters to search for the missing city. This, of course, affected the Zeluka more than anyone else. Over the next 2 ages, 13 Zeluka kings would head off into the north in search of the missing city, and none would return. Even other dwarves would get involved. After Khazad-dûm fell to Durin's bane, Thrain I would spend several years searching for the missing city at the behest of a Zeluka dwarf named Voin, although he would quickly lose interest. But despite this, no one ever found Thafar-gathol, leading to some like Gandalf to assume that the city never actually existed. And to be fair, over the course of the story found in LOTRO, we never do actually find Thafar-gathol. Or do we? Because as it turns out, Thafar-gathol probably did exist, just not in the form that the legend spoke of. So where was Thafar-gathol, what happened to it, and why is there this massive myth surrounding it? Well, firstly, there seems to be more information about Thafar-gathol than just that mad dwarf's ravings. This is because there's a song amongst the Zeluka that laments the fall of the city, and it's this song that gives us 2 very important clues. The first is the location of the city. The song mentions Mountains Grey on 2 occasions, which may imply that the city was in the vicinity of the Grey Mountains. This would explain why the Zeluka were able to go missing. Although nominally claimed by Durin's folk, the Grey Mountains were always wild and unexplored, and, of course, they're quite large. But rather interestingly, When Durin's folk ended up settling in the Grey Mountains after the fall of Khazad-dûm, a kingdom they called Grarik, they did uncover evidence of Zeluka settlement. Beneath a mountain called the Rathlorn, Durin's folk discovered that a great delving had already been made, so they built their capital above it, Thikil-gundu, the Steel Keep. However, Thikil-gundu was never associated with Thafar-gathol because the latter was supposed to be rich, even containing mithril. However, no great riches were found at Thikil-gundu, and instead the mines there primarily produced iron. The second clue from the song talks about the city's fate. The back half of the song is quite dark, mentioning that Thafar-gathol's fall was very swift. The song claims that some shadow awoke the Wormkin, the dragons, and they suddenly and relentlessly assaulted Thafar-gathol, and in the end no trace of the hall remained. So according to Zeluka legend, the city didn't just suddenly disappear, it was attacked by dragons and mostly destroyed. We don't know how exactly this tale ended up with the Zeluka or whether it was entirely made up, but it is consistent with the other things that we know about the area. For example, in the Withered Heath, a valley between the two arms of the Grey Mountains, one can find the Anvil of Winterstife, a giant glacier. It was believed by many of the Zeluka that Thafar-gathol might be found beneath the glacier, as evidenced by the fact that the corpses of the 13 Zeluka kings who went off in search of the city could later be found there. Unfortunately, the truth was far worse. Beneath the anvil is the imprisoned Frost Horde, a horde of cold drakes and dragons that served Hrimil Frostheart, one of the greatest dragons to serve Morgoth. We learn from Hrimil herself that in the past, the anvil had been broken open on 3 separate occasions. One of these was by an army of Zeluka that was searching for Thafar-gathol. One of the other occasions is implied to be when Durin's folk were driven from the Grey Mountains during the War of the Dwarves and Dragons. The other, first occasion, may have been when Thafar-gathol was destroyed. Either this mysterious shadow opened up the anvil, or the Zeluka did, when, rather classically, they started delving too deeply and too greedily. They awakened the dragons, and then the dragons destroyed them. Many years later, Thikil-gundu, the capital of Grarik, would also be destroyed by dragons. So from what we know so far, the Zeluka didn't just mysteriously vanish while on the way to Gundabad. Instead, they founded halls in the Grey Mountains and lived there in isolation for several centuries before the city was suddenly and thoroughly destroyed by dragons from the Anvil of Winterstife. There seems to have been some survivors, because stories of the fall were preserved in song, but the stories from these survivors were overshadowed by the tales of Thafar-gathol from a singular Zeluka dwarf. Many years later, Durin's folk would uncover evidence of a Zeluka city and found Thikil-gundu above it, but the site was not linked to Thafar-gathol, because it lacked the riches that the city allegedly had. But it does seem that Thikil-gundu and the mysterious Zeluka city were founded at the same place. So where did this tale of Thafar-gathol come from? How did a tale of a fabulously rich lost city remain in the Dwarven consciousness for thousands of years? Well, Durin the Seventh, who we aid on the journey, might have the answers, and it goes back to Mozog. You see, for his betrayal, Mozog was executed. At least, officially. In reality, he went deep below Gundabad and entered a stone sleep, but from this sleep he could still send visions to dwarves in the outside world. Durin suggests that it's possible that Mozog offered guidance to certain dwarves, perhaps revealing his own tale of betrayal. During this story, he may have provided visions of Bir-Zahar, his golden city in the clouds. For what reason? Durin the Seventh is left wondering. So, Zeluka wanderers in the Grey Mountains, lost, hungry, tired, may have been offered guidance by Mozog and thus may have seen visions of Bir-Zahar and presumed that it was Thafar-gathol, the lost Zeluka city. And then, these Zeluka survived and spread the tale, and over time, it replaced the true tale of Thafar-gathol, an iron city in the Grey Mountains, with the idea of a golden city, lost somewhere in the north, that was rich beyond all imagination. So it might be that the legend of Thafar-gathol was built upon bones of truth. There was a lost Zeluka city, but it wasn't wealthy, and it was found, and Thikil-gundu was built atop it. Instead, the city that was believed to be Thafar-gathol was instead Bir-Zahar, Mozog's golden city in the Misty Mountains. But by the time of the Third Age, Bir-Zahar wasn't golden, It was windswept ruins occupied by orcs and worse. We don't know what Mozog intended, but unfortunately his misinterpreted visions created a legend that led many dwarves to their deaths, including 13 Zeluka kings. Or maybe Thafar-gathol did exist, still lost somewhere in the frozen north. Maybe it was so thoroughly destroyed that no traces of it remain. Maybe it still exists in some hidden valley or behind some hidden doors. Perhaps the Zeluka delving found at Thikil-gundu was merely an outpost. Maybe Bir-Zahar had absolutely nothing to do with it, and that mad dwarf from the Second Age genuinely found something that could never be found again. Whatever the truth is, it's a cool tale that deserves to be told. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting, and I hope you survived my pronunciation of the city that I shall not name anymore, simply because I had a nightmare of a time trying to pronounce it. The tale of the city can be experienced in the Legacy of Durin updates for the Lord of the Rings Online. It deals with a lot more than the missing city, and personally, I think it's some of the best stuff that was ever made in LOTRO. If you have any suggestions for other bits of lore from LOTRO or anywhere else, please let me know. Cheers, farewell, and low-hanging fruit, but perhaps the real Thafar-gathol was the friends we made along the way.